Alright, so my speech will start now. Proposition can't simply look at the phase level by simply saying that BRICS are able to offer everything Latin American nations ever needed, from freedom and less dependencies on the US. Instead, our side look at the bigger picture by emphasizing the benefits and the well-being of Latin American nations, specifically what they have to face in return for those benefits when BRICS expand or when they join BRICS. What exactly do they have to align with when joining BRICS? Since let's not forget about some of BRICS leading members such as Russia, China, who are one way or another rivals of the US or are in opposition to the US in the first place. It's not like so easy that Latin American nations can just join BRICS without any alignments, without any promises. It's not that easy, and we'll show you furthermore in this speech. First of all, for some clarifications, we'd like to restate clearly about our side's goal. Stability is the key to a country's success, and what we strongly want throughout this entire debate is to simply prove how stability is exactly in the interest of Latin American nations, since the debate specifically says how BRICS expansion is in the interest of Latin American nations, and we're talking about interests of Latin American nations. So what they want specifically is not on the tremendous benefits that proposition has outlined, or that total dependency is actually bad. That is, like, all of the benefits that proposition has outlined may be good. However, one needs to consider the point of stability, the most important thing for a country to thrive. Even if they do receive the benefits as proposition has mentioned, will this be stable enough for them to continue do trading or acquire help from countries like the US, who is still an important factor to Latin American nations? Before we move on to our responses and clash, we'll take that POI. Okay, we specifically says that our stance here is stability. And why is that? Let's look at BRICS in the first place. BRICS members, for example, like some of the leading members from BRICS, as we can state here, is like Russia, China, India, etc. And all of those countries face controversy one way or another. Like, one country is in war, other countries are in debt, and other countries are faced with some of the weirdest policy in the world. So we believe that this is not a very stable organization for Latin American nations to be in, and later on we'll prove to you how the US is actually an important factor when it comes to Latin American nations' development and economic growth altogether. So a couple of responses here. First of all, responses. So the proposition, first of all, they mentioned to us that this will have economic sovereignty when joining BRICS, and there will be harsh conditions under the US control, and there will be two huge economies backing up, and therefore be stable. Don't be blinded by all the benefits that proposition tells you. Proposition never paid any attention to the alignment that LA nations have to align with once they join BRICS. It doesn't look so simple like how they show. It isn't simply like when you join an organization and suddenly receive all those huge benefits. Let us remind proposition that BRICS is increasingly dominated by larger powers like China, Russia, and India, meaning Latin American nations are unlikely to shape decisions and may be used to actually serve to the interests of others. And it's easy to say that joining BRICS won't make life any easier for Latin American nations, since they already lack of power in the first place, which means that they will definitely have limited voting rights and influence over the decision made in BRICS. And also, the other side they said to us on sovereignty exists on their side. They're simply contradicting themselves by saying that Latin American nations get the freedom, they get the sovereignty, while Latin American nations themselves are relying on BRICS in the first place. And reliance is not something that is in the interest of Latin American nations in the first place, right? They also mentioned there'll be economic growth, there'll be money, just in time for investment, and there'll be no reliance on the US dollar. BRICS is domestically messy. A fragile eco like Latin American nations joining will be even more detrimental to it rather than simply being with US. So let's move on to one of the most important clashes in this debate. First of all is on dependency, right? Because we'll simply further expand on the fact that ties with the US are still crucial, and proposition will just make it worse by breaking ties with them through joining BRICS. not take any more POIs from this point, even if we don't receive all those immense benefits as proposition as mentioned. What we do have is a stable relationship with one of the world's leading powers. Many Latin American nations countries depend heavily on the US for exports, for imports, and foreign investment, right? And plus, let's not forget the fact that the US is the largest source of investment, for example, foreign direct investment in countries like Colombia, Chile, or Peru in the first place. And let's also not forget that the US is also very close to Latin American nations, meaning that there are millions and millions of Latin American nations in the US, and breaking the ties with the US would be posed as extremely detrimental. Proposition has to understand how, in a sense, Latin American nations still rely heavily on the US, their investment as a trading partner, and their assistance as a whole. We don't understand how joining BRICS in the first place would be so beneficial to Latin American nations, considering how the US plays a big role to Latin American nations. Sure, proposition can mention and prove again and again how Latin American nations can reduce dependency on the US dollar and get more sovereignty. They prove nothing to us how their ties with the US will still stay strong. What we're able to prove on our side here is that we get stability. We get what their side can get, which is simply a stable relationship with some of the world's leading powers. And joining BRICS will simply mean that you're breaking ties with the US, which is posed detrimental, because from history and from all this time, then Latin American nations and the US have been trading, and the US has been one of the largest sources of investment to Latin American nations, to some of their countries as well. So we are able to successfully prove to you how on our side, our stance here is simply stability. We don't really care on how proposition can show you how Latin American nations can be able to get more fund, can be able to be less dependent on the US dollar. What we see from proposition is what they get in return is a reliance on BRICS, a reliance on countries like Russia or China, which in turn Latin American nations will themselves be involved in a cycle of controversy, from those countries who they themselves are rivals of the US in the first place, leading to more controversy, which definitely is not in the interest of Latin American nations at all. Now let's move on to the second one, is who is able to fulfill the needs and interests of Latin American nations, because Latin American nations' interests are stable development and no controversy involved. However, still be able to improve economic growth is actually pretty simple. First of all, we have clearly mentioned how staying away from BRICS, Latin American nations will be able to stay away from all of those controversial and avoid the instability and risk of BRICS controversial politics. And they have never rebutted this point on our side of the house ever. Our side provides sustainability and reliable trade with the US and other Western institutions, since Latin American nations have to do trade with the US, and this is what has been happening ever since the dawn of time. And what our side successfully portrayed to you by the end of this debate is very simple. We are able to provide to you, and we are able to prove how we on our side is able to fulfill the needs and fulfill the interests of Latin American nations, which is stability, again, sustainability, and also how they're able to achieve a stable relationship with some of the world's leading powers, which of course proposition can't achieve. Very proud to oppose.